Eric Freedman is a professor and dean of the School of Media Arts at Columbia College Chicago. He's the author most recently of The Persistence of Code in Game Engine Culture, which I think it's 2020. So it is out because it's 22. Mm-hmm. And as well as Transient Images, Personal Media and Public Frameworks, 2011. He serves on the editorial board of the International Journal of Creative Media Research and the advisory board of the Communication and Media Studies Research Network. So I'm going to hand it off to Professor Freedman. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. Thanks, Heather. It's great to be here. I appreciate being hosted and to talk about some new work. This is part, but not part of my my next, or the book that I'm currently on deadline for, which is on artificial intelligence and playable media. But it sort of fits between these spaces, between the work that I was doing on video game architectures and artificial intelligence. I must say that some of this was written or conceived of in my head with a particular type of audience. So I don't know the context of the graduate student body, so how much you know and don't know. So some of this may be too rudimentary, some of it may be too advanced, but sort of let me know when we get to that sort of point of the sort of conversation if I need to clarify anything that I've spoken about. I'm going to share my screen since I've got some things for us to look at along the way. And I will share my sound as well. There you go. And I hope you can all see that and hear. There's nothing to hear yet, but you can all see that. So I'm going to be talking about the role that the influence that video game technologies have had on both game and non-game media, and their design and development environments and runtime components are software systems that are known as game engines. And they've promoted a wide range of uses for real-time 3D visualization that extend far beyond the field of video game development. The software systems that drive video games have provided a common framework for digital content creation across what were once distinct media verticals: film, television, even manufacturing and industrial fabrication, architecture and urban planning, and other interactive media forms, including digital twins, any form that can leverage photorealistic visual effects and programmable software-generated assets. So what we see is that game engines are influencing just about every aspect of, for example, the film and television production pipeline, including pre-visualization, advanced in-camera visual effects. All of these things are complementing what was once the solitary purview of post-production. What we see in film and television production is more and more directors and cinematographers are working in tandem with digital imaging technicians. Popular TV programs like The Mandalorian, this crowd probably knows, or Westworld, have leveraged game engine technologies throughout their respective production processes to seamlessly integrate physical and virtual assets. And both series have used elaborate filmmaking techniques to map and capture virtual settings rendered in real time across custom-built LED walls while recording live performers. And while game engines are being used across media forms, they were built as development tools for interactive digital content creation and really as code frameworks to formally define the field of play, meaning the game environment and its assets, as well as the executable functions, meaning what happens during gameplay throughout video games. They're the building blocks for efficient real-time visualization, and their programming is continuing to influence a broader and broader swath of visual culture. This is why I think it's important to talk about these structures. Video game engines have a lot to do with powering our visual futures. As data and visuality continue to converge, software development companies that include Unity Technologies and Epic Games, the latter of which I'll focus on today, are rapidly iterating their products to tackle new marketplaces. And they have plans, in fact, to colonize the metaverse. Many of the images that we consume and interact with are really artfully crafted, engineered media born by these environments or these ecosystems of hardware, software, and programming. So in this reading, what I want to do is examine a tool that's fairly new to the arsenal of video game developer Epic Games, and that's the MetaHuman Creator. The MetaHuman Creator, which is part of Epic's proprietary Unreal Engine, was revealed in February 2021 and subsequently released in April of the same year through the developer's early access program. The application, which is free, features an accessible user interface, and it allows game developers and 3D content creators to quickly build high fidelity digital humans. And I'll just play their promo video so you have a sense of sort of how this tool works and what they're pitching.
I could be one of many.
주인공이 덕대 나를.
Je pourrais être architecte.
Ou guide.
Quizá un artista. You create the narrative. I am MetaHuman.
So the questions that I'm posing in my analysis that I'm not necessarily looking to answer today, but are the MetaHuman Creator and similar simplified building tools democratizing the field of digital content creation, which is sort of what Epic is pitching, in this easy access, familiar user interface? Are they also fostering more diverse representations and narratives? And are they supporting the free play of identity and playable media? So these tools, which include the entire Unreal Engine suite, shape visual culture by translating it into a data set that can be manipulated by an algorithm. And what we have is digital content developers can transform visual artifacts, whether they be environments or objects and characters, in real time with simple user interface controls, such as draggable assets and variable or numeric sliders. And these tools represent a way of seeing and knowing the world, and the representations they produce are part of these hermetically sealed and privately held encoding processes that include a company's original data, its application programming, its proprietary build environment, and its interface. So for me, software and platform studies as critical approaches to the theories and practices of computing might help us unpack both the promise and the perils of Epic's sophisticated character generator. The MetaHuman Creator is, after all, it's a data-driven software system. It's an analytical engine. It's an integrated system of calculation and design, and it can sculpt and transform its source data and streamline this production process of digital humans. For those of you who are not familiar how this system works, the MetaHuman Creator, it's a cloud-streamed, web-based application that lets content developers create these high-fidelity digital characters without really being steeped in the technical processes of things like character generation, rigging, animation, and other in-engine real-time functionality. It provides a truly rapid method for developing 3D character models that can be animated with a variety of other programs like Autodesk Maya. And it draws from, as its foundation, a library of scans of real people, and then allows 3D content developers to quickly create these unique photorealistic, fully rigged digital humans by mixing together different parts of real people while changing each character's facial textures and geometries and simultaneously updating the underlying rig. So it holds on to the actual mechanics of the underlying rig. And the library as it stands now includes a number of prefabricated MetaHuman presets that represent the generalized and rather soft contours of race, ethnicity, gender diversity, and a broad spectrum of individualized skin tones, textures, physiognomies, and style types. And the tool allows visual artists to really rapidly and seamlessly, as you saw in that clip, manipulate a character's facial features, adjust things like skin complexion, select from a range of preset body types and styles, and then each finished character can be exported, again, fully rigged, meaning fully functional, movable, and ready to animate within Epic's Unreal Engine. And that's part of their licensing agreement to utilize these characters within the Unreal Engine. So from a technical standpoint, the process collapses more traditional scanning to rig development pipelines and wraps the creative process in a very familiar user interface to really facilitate the design process for those who are developing inside the Unreal Engine. And for that reason, it really promises to advance the field of virtual production for games and other immersive experiences in fields that draw from these high fidelity and responsibly animated virtual assets and digital doubles. I have this slide on the screen because I think the tool also animates some of the cultural politics of the face generating algorithm that was vividly illustrated on this cover of Time magazine back in 1993, which was a composite of the new face of America, created from a computer-generated mix of individuals from several racial and ethnic groups. In this particularly seamless synthesis designed to illustrate how immigrants are shaping the United States in a multicultural society, really belies the work involved, conceals the policy decisions, conceals the socioeconomic divides, and conceals the myriad forces of disenfranchisement that impede such a very seamless vision of progress. So all of those sort of obstacles, barriers, boundaries, margins are obscured by sort of the fascination with what we can do with surface algorithms. I'd say MetaHuman creation also shares an awkward legacy in its dependence on deeply multi-layered algorithmic manipulation with visual trickery and disinformation, which is an unfortunate byproduct of GANs, GANs, which are generative adversarial networks. And GANs are a type of machine learning that uses a pair of artificial intelligence algorithms in a large volume of data to try and accurately replicate real-world image patterns until the fakes are indistinguishable from the originals. One of the results of advanced GAN research is the ability to develop unique human faces that can pass for real people. And collectively, these systems are rendering visual culture from a perspective that, as it advances, is actually less and less determined by human intervention, although it was originally conceived and developed from within an anthropocentric design perspective and is inherently prone to humanistic bias. These representations, again, are not simply happening within their own platforms, but they are impacting the visual grammar, the organizational labor, the technical structures, the industrial models of film, television, gaming, related media forms. For those of you who aren't familiar with how GANs work, it requires training, I said, two algorithms, a generator and a discriminator. So in this process, you actually have AI competing against itself. The generator learns to create plausible data, while the latter, the discriminator, learns to discriminate between the generator's fake data and real data until the process becomes almost much more seamless, much more competent and capable of generating realistic images, voices, videos. Any of you who have seen the fake Tom Cruise videos, and suggests the goal of intelligence research may be twofold. How do we simulate human intelligence to such a degree that machines might replace human beings as part of the process and occupy their locations within an organization, so we no longer need the real actor? And it's also about a representational framework or development pipeline that also sort of displaces human labor and allows machines to carry out these sort of design tasks. For those of you, I'll give you sort of a little background. In 2018, a team of NVIDIA technology researchers proposed StyleGAN. And StyleGAN is a style-based generative architecture that is tasked with analyzing and synthesizing existing facial image data to produce these novel photorealistic images. I'll give you a sort of brief sort of clip here so you understand how these style GANs actually work with human faces. We're going to get too technical, so I'll stop it there. But for those of you who may not actually have looked at the NVIDIA's research, this style GAN, this technology that was being developed by NVIDIA, became the sort of architecture for what software engineer Philip Wang used in 2019. He used, because the style GAN is an open source generator, so the same technology developed by NVIDIA is used in an open source model by Philip Wang to create "This Person Does Not Exist." And this is just a sampling of images from "This Person Does Not Exist." For those of you who haven't checked out the website, "This Person Does Not Exist" is a website that conjures its fake portraits from existing image data and produces new human faces every time that you refresh the page. So the style GAN is operating in the background. Every time you click refresh, a new face of a fake person will be generated. And this data-driven image modeling, this is just sort of 7 selective faces from "This Person Does Not Exist." This data-driven image modeling is based on always a degree of normalization. That's how the algorithm works. How do we train the algorithm on existing data sets and output the information in ways that match stylistic social conventions and expectations? So the goal of the system are always sort of normalizing to, to create an unsupervised image-to-image translation and the production of a novel image that conforms to common facial shapes and common facial features. So you'll never get anything, unbelievable or radicalized, as a result of this process. That's sort of the modeling at work. So the style GAN in every case operates within and produces what we would conceive of as acceptable structures. And while it's a fascinating visual tool, it carries with it, as I'm sure you sense, much starker undercurrents. AI tools are being deployed within institutions that are historically marked by systemic discrimination, in housing, in the workplace, in the criminal justice system, our financial institutions. And bias is baked into the outcomes of what AI is constantly asked to do and predict. The data used to train machine intelligence is often underrepresentative of people of color, of women, and of other marginalized groups. And those fault lines impact the design, development, implementation of and outcomes of AI across a broad range of tech and tech-dependent industries, where it really becomes more difficult to extract what's happening, meaning to extract the signaling processes embedded in the automated systems that are designed to create more efficient workflows and more realistic images. And while what I've shown you, including the MetaHuman Creator, doesn't really rely on AI per se and is instead focused on the physical aspects of character creation, these assets are primed for intelligence uses as non-player characters driven by AI subsystems, or as intelligent agents in a wider array of video game and game adjacent environments. So since its launch, the MetaHuman Creator has been successfully coupled with an AI voice actor platform developed by Replica Studios that enables developers to create AI characters that look and sound human where we have voice actors training the AI how to perform. So we have this sort of whole hermetic system about how characters look and what they sound like. That is all has a human component as its base. But again, those sort of those systems are then concealed in the actual ongoing output, where AI slowly but surely takes over the performative dimension of character. And while it's a unique enterprise, I believe the MetaHuman Creator carries the cultural weight of all of these other simulation systems, intelligent or not, that approximate human subjects. Again, as I said, MetaHuman Creator is a fluid process that really shortens the timeline to produce its human character assets, and it streamlines the overall development pipeline. So there's a labor implication here as well. The people who use or work with MetaHuman Creator are never given direct access to the primary scan library in its data. So there is an existing library of original human scans, but instead what you're asked to do is work with and select from a cast of MetaHuman preset characters that are artifacts of that library and composite representations of its raw data. So reading the tool from a sort of critical vantage point rather than a purely industrial vantage point, in this sort of speedy transformation of character rigs and other non-binary attributes, this ability to blend between characters highlights what I believe is the sort of potential queerness or openness of data, yet most commercial demonstrations of this tool speed through all of these mutable subjects, ultimately to land on a predictable end result, a fixed result. So a dynamic creative process ultimately has to yield to some sort of stasis, to the construction of a functional and fixed character build of a certain physiognomic type. So the image library, which is a really complex data set, has to constantly behave in plausible ways and according to a number of marked constraints to produce these anatomically believable outputs. And while code may be fluid and sort of not have any anatomical fixity, these things always wind up becoming much more constricted if our goal, if our intent is to produce believable, high quality digital characters. All of the MetaHumans use an underlying skeleton asset. So while their facial features may be unique, the features of defined body, face, hair, and clothes, all of these are parented to a governing skeletal mesh, and those structures allow the external features of these characters to be purposefully animated and readily swapped. So these distinct bodies that are pulled from the library and blended together to make custom assets, always remain functionally locked to an underlying mesh. So even the external skins of these characters can be readily swapped out. So this female character and another male character may share the same underlying skeletal rig. So a process of animation retargeting enables animations to be reused between characters who have the same skeleton asset, even if they have different proportions or additional bones, as long as they share the same bone hierarchy and use the same rig to pass animation data from one skeleton to another. So even the specificity of character type as gets locked into a model, becomes swappable based on the skeletal asset that drives the motion of all of these characters in the same way. Some of the questions that I sort of raised throughout my research is, these metahumans are designed intelligently, but they don't possess intelligence. They look real. I don't really know if they are uncanny or not. I don't know if they truly evoke an emotional response. Their facial features, their geometries, their expressions, their movements are all plausible since they're tied to that underlying skeletal rig, but they would need another programming layer, another AI subsystem to really give them agency, to really make them semi-autonomous, contextually driven, and motivated characters. But I think that's the prompt that's really posed by Epic Games in that commercial reveal video that asks us or commands us, you create the narrative. So these are sort of primed for sort of narrative appropriation. And while these assets are still in need of a narrative, I think we can still read them as meaningful traces of a particular industrial process, which is all about an ongoing push toward hyperrealism in commercial media that has created a visual economy that is now supported by an industrial apparatus that privileges how we master these tools of production, and where the bodies and the politics are often cleaved in the design process. And there's an interesting sort of conversation among Unreal developers where they ask, each other, like, who is your favorite MetaHuman character? And they choose based on, this sort of very sort of whimsical, like sort of visual reading of these characters that they produced, which are really sort of sharply depoliticized, in just in terms of a, like, let's choose, as they do in the selection video around this character, let's choose this character or that character, and let's sort of just mix them up together. So what I see is, Epic's multi-ethnic, multiracial, even transgender MetaHuman Creator is from a Unreal or Epic Games perspective, really just a design tool, not a narrative engine. The transitions are simple and seamless, and the traces of non-binary and non-white identities are simply part of a larger color palette of various ethnicities and genders in the database. So I think the MetaHuman creators really mastered cosmetic diversity and the rather quick fabrication of multiculturalism. And it seems to suggest that technology can be colorblind and embrace a certain in-betweenness. The rapid transitions that we see between subject positions is really a masterful visual spectacle that seems incompatible with any genuine concern for the difficulties of lived experience, or lived experience with difficult body boundaries. Although Epic's developers suggest that the quality and fidelity of its metahumans can create player empathy. So I think what we see in metahuman creation is a really feat or spectacle of bodily governance, of regulating flow, of regulating discrete bodies, and the power and privilege associated with this particular tool is not simply about how humans are represented, but who produces these representations and who owns these bodies at the end of the day. Because metahuman creation requires a certain degree of technical know-how, as well as the requisite processing power, as well as the requisite network access, and the necessary Unreal Engine supports to run these real-time renders. And at the same time, if we step back a bit, we know that the MetaHuman Creator and its Unreal Engine parent, meaning Epic Games, they sit within existing socioeconomic relations that guarantee the almost inequitable distribution of and access to technology. This application is based on and requires Epic's proprietary pixel streaming technology that can pull data from its central server, and is in part the product of the company's acquisition of a Serbian-based company, 3Lateral, which pulled the technology for crafting these virtual humans closer to the Unreal Engine by adding 3Lateral's research on volumetric facial capture and facial rigging to Epic's portfolio. So what we see in Epic is a constant sort of acquisition cycle of what do we need? We need 3Lateral, we need to capitalize on volumetric facial capture, let's pull this company into our orbit. We need sort of stronger networking power or server power or data draws, so let's work with our pixel streaming technology. So it does indeed become this sort of real, sort of hermetic, sort of data-driven ecosystems. And as I suggested, the MetaHuman presets, or the series of characters that are based on 3D scans of real people, these were built from a data set that required a significant number of cameras, a significant number of processing power to create complete 3D models of real human faces. And in this case, 3Lateral provided the resources for Epic Games to accomplish this task. But we don't know who provided the raw materials that make up this sort of racial and ethnic and gender mix of the Unreal database. We don't know how precisely these individuals were arranged and transformed into these preset metahuman characters, because the library that you are choosing from is one step removed, multiple steps removed from that initial sort of library scan of real human faces. These are synthesized to begin with, and you are basing a model around pre-synthesized character sets. So what we see, and this is sort of what you may understand as being represented here, in this particular slide, end users choose one or more MetaHuman presets from the database of pre-made characters. This is simply a sampling of some of these pre-made characters from the Unreal Engine database. So end users can choose one or more of these MetaHuman presets or character assets from this database. And again, there are at this point a library of more than 50 named individuals. So all of these individuals organized alphabetically from Ada to Zen, they all are uniquely named. And you can then create your MetaHuman by enabling the application's blend mode. So what you do is you can then choose additional character presets and drag and drop these 3D portrait models into a concentric circle around the primary preset. In this, what you see represented here is the application viewport. So in this case, there's one primary preset in the center, 3 additional character presets that are orbiting in the concentric circle. And then using viewport, you can sort of choose your blend, and start to sort of move elements of all of these concentric characters into the primary character reset. And you can then map their facial features onto one another. And this is, again, always designed to produce plausible results from the database as it outputs what are custom blends of digital individuals. One other sort of interesting sort of element is once you get done constructing your fabricated sort of model is that Unreal Engine's Live Link Face app allows developers to capture live facial performance with an iPhone or iPad and map that performance in real time to their MetaHuman characters. So in this case, you see from Lucas Ridley, one of his tutorial, he is in the lower right-hand corner. The Live Link Face app is represented on his phone next to him. And in this case, what he's doing is he's capturing his facial performance to one of the preset MetaHuman characters and animating it with his facial performance. So this becomes sort of the ecosystem of preset character, Unreal's Live Link Face app, your ability to map your performance to your MetaHuman character. You can also link your MetaHuman character to other full body motion capture workflows. So you can actually develop pose animations that capture based on sort of real-time motion capture. And then these software ecosystems are compatible with other development tools like Maya and Motion Builder. So you can sort of do some replotting or fine tuning. And that's the sort of nature of the sort of MetaHuman sort of creation, is it has to play well with other data ecosystems. At the same time, it has to be rendered and published inside Unreal Engine in order to comply with the company's licensing agreement. Moreover, again, as I mentioned, Epic continues to foreground the value of all of its other services that allow you to run this application through a circuit of relations that includes not just what 3Lateral has given it, but also what Cubic Motion, another acquisition, gives it in terms of facial animation technologies. It has acquired a number of other complementary companies that include Twinmotion for its real-time architectural visualization software. Epic recently acquired Quixel for its Megascan library of 2D and 3D photogrammetry assets. So what we have in the Epic arsenal is a consolidated, robust suite of 3D content creation tools created inside a hermetic data system that is both people and motion and environments and an object asset library, all of the elements are blended together. And again, as I pointed out, so that we can start to see Epic Games as one of many parties looking to colonize the metaverse. Before I sort of wrap this up, I want to suggest that Epic, of course, is not alone in its pursuit of building the metaverse and populating it with human assets. People Sans People is Unity's open source human-centric synthetic data generator. This is sort of a sampling from Unity technologies. This was released to the public just earlier this year. And what Unity provides, and those of you who work with Unity, Unity is also an engine-based game developer who is using its engine-based tool in other environments and other build environments. What Unity provides with People Sans People is simulation-ready 3D human assets that are coupled to a parameterized lighting and camera system, meaning you can take an asset, you can drop it inside any environment, and it's coupled to lighting and camera. So you're not going to lose that sort of the fidelitous relationship between your character and environment. The 3D human models that we see here in People Sans People are all drawn from a subset of the what's called the render people library. The reason it's called People Sans People because it's anonymizing the data. So these may be based on real world scans of photogrammetry scans of real people, but by anonymizing the data, these become sort of neutral objects that cannot be associated or reattached to any one individual. So the 3D human models that Unity is using are drawn from a subset of render people. And for those of you who have never shopped for pre-rendered people, this is the render people library. Render people has its own 3D people library products that are built from 3D photogrammetry scans, which are sort of high resolution scans of more than, in this case, 4,000 live models that can be inserted into a range of 3D visualization projects. So again, in this case, you can purchase a model in the render people shop, and you can drop it into any sales environment, any sort of interactive environment that you want. Again, these are based on sort of real models. So in the render people environment, you've got a sort of real actor who can act as a salesperson or a host at your university campus on a virtual tour. You don't have to build that model, and it can be synchronized with your environment. People Sans People, what it does is simply thinks about sort of the ethics or data privacy by anonymizing the data from the render people models, modulating the appearances of its virtual people to create more customizable data sets. And then it also allows you to train the models to adapt to a specified environment. So we can then generalize the model to that domain. So it can fit almost any domain. As I close, I just want to say that sort of game engine, I think this is sort of an important beyond sort of although I focused on people, game engines and their data infrastructures are really the building blocks for the metaverse. And developers like Epic and Unity are using their engines, their assets, their data holdings to claim territory. And as I pointed out, to buy up competing or complementary technology companies to really secure these hermetic world building systems. As I mentioned in 2019, they acquired Quixel, so they added this world atlas of high resolution 3D scans of environmental specimens, surfaces, materials, objects, and vegetation. Unity in 2021 announced its plan to acquire Weta Digital and the company's proprietary visual effects suite, stating its intent to unlock the potential of the metaverse. So what we find Unity and Epic both doing is, again, building these people models and then acquiring these robust asset libraries of urban and natural environments, of flora and fauna, of man-made objects, of materials, textures, and more, to really have this sort of robust sort of architecture that is a fully fledged architecture. From my own perspective, I turn to critical media studies beyond sort of studies of production, because I think at the end of the day, we need to interrogate the formal and structural properties of these texts. And at some level, we need to understand the production process. And that, I hope I've given you sort of some insight into what happens here. This is the sort of animation retargeting that I've talked about. So this particular MetaHuman character can be mapped to almost any, and any other MetaHuman character can be sort of retargeted to the same animation rig, the universality of type. But I think it's important to ask whether a tool that can produce multicultural subjects is really empowered to produce substantive social change and create counter narratives that challenge existing racial and ethnic inequities. I think these questions are pressing in this closed circuit of relations because human assets are being fabricated from the same identical algorithmic architecture as their virtual worlds. They're being constructed from and operating within the same governing data structures. And as I said, the promotional materials that surround the release of Epic's MetaHuman Creator focus in on what characters look like and how plausible they are, rather than what they're doing or what they're being asked to do. And these representations always lack context. But as the engine-driven traces of the natural world continue to move toward greater fidelity and to a greater alignment between physiognomic and mechanical systems, the power of Epic's tool is not simply what it does, but how it does it. The user interface is designed as a direct manipulation tool where end users can monitor their design choices in real time, visualize the various sort of character deformations, as they move around these facial markers and the sliders, but they don't really have access to what's happening, beneath the surface here. So the question is the MetaHuman Creator an engine for diversity? Is it simply a spectacle of control? And where video game technologies have extended their algorithmic influence into the machinery of a much broader media and information economy. And they've succeeded by holding on to the humanistic attachments of these algorithms that make their software so welcome and familiar to many developers and designers who are struggling with these problems and to get their products running. So by examining these software systems and their technologies that undergird the representation, I think we can begin to understand the cultural power of code as it gets written into these data architectures. And then in the case of MetaHuman Creator, we have to understand that software is both a matter of engineering what's happening in the background, but also language. It has to be legible. It has to follow certain scripted rules. It has to organize. It has to communicate. It has to represent information in ways that make sense. It has to shape all of its image data into a fixed set of material relations that follow the rules of successful game production or interactive media production. These creations have to make sense. The bodies have to work. They have to perform without failure. They have to create really responsive bodies. So there's a broader lesson here for me in shifting our attention to both the deeper architectures of game design and development, but also thinking about what's happening at the image level as well. We have to unpack the privilege that comes with the ability to really engage in this machine-based identity surfing. We have to always continue to unpack, to understand that these hygienic or functional, understandable distillations of the material world, are based on sort of an underlying information architecture. And there are other scholars and critics that you might be familiar with that have sort of approached this. Jennifer Malkowski and Andrea Russworm in their study of game representation talk about, we don't want to simply pay attention to code analysis, because if we do that, we are thinking that programming is purely technical and not particularly ideological. And at the same time, game representation is always tethered to software and hardware. So we need to develop and expand our approach to media studies, which you may already be doing, and try to situate computation and representation side by side and understand their interrelated disciplinary histories and practices. Understand that digital media have an outer layer and an inner layer, if you want to think of it that way, that representations are governed by code, and they also are the provenance of both media history and history of computing. So that's what I see going on here in terms of the question that we have to always remind ourselves is, like, what is the level of narrative possibility? Are these systems simply amplifying existing hierarchies of knowledge and power? Our work with metahumans from a design perspective is commonly limited to the surface level of interventions with the user interface. But as a countermeasure, I believe when you have to think about how these proprietary software environments are built, we need to strive for deeper computational literacy. And that's if we want to figure out the design biases of these imaging systems and consider how they are operating in and regulating the world at large. With that, I will sort of pause and hope you have some sort of response or some input, some questions, or some parallel investigations that you're all involved with. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was really, really interesting. I wanted to ask a quick question. That last simulation we were seeing over and over again of the sort of robot human and the human, and they're the same, right? And their hands are empty, but it's simulating like holding weapons, right? Mm-hmm. Just like without the weapon being there. So I just want to make sure that was what was really happening. It struck me as very strange, right? And it points to like, well, what are we going to do with these responsive bodies that don't function or that always function correctly, right? And it's going to be playing games with guns. And I'm not a gaming person at all, so I don't know like the whole range of Epic's games. But are there different, more unusual things that these bodies are designed to do? Are there, when you talked about like responsive bodies that don't fail, I immediately thought of like pornographic applications of simulated bodies. And at that point, it occurred to me like, oh yeah, this really limited kinds of body creation would really have a negative impact if it was used in a pornographic context, where like the range of body types would be possibly like really kind of all over the place, right? As opposed to really tightly constricted in what you showed. So this just kind of a little prompt that might get you going on a few additional thoughts.
Yeah, because the rigs there is a tension between sort of the marketing and the design orientation of the product. So what you're rightly noting is those sort of Epic Games or Unreal developers who are, because what I showed you is pulled straight from that last shot, that last animated loop is pulled from the Unreal documentation. There's this tension between like the Unreal documentation that shows you the traditional, there are a couple poses blended together. The assumption is a particular type of action-based gameplay. You know, whether it's a third-person shooter, there's a certain type of action orientation written into the documentation that accompanies that's peppered throughout sort of what Unreal is proposing. But you are correct in noting the open narrative prompt is, as long as there's a rig, these characters can be made to perform in any way. The limitation there is back to the Unreal Engine architecture. If they have to be sort of published within Unreal, what are the limiting contours of the Unreal Engine that allow or disallow certain bodily performances?
Thank you. I see Shrishti has her hand up.
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Shrishti. I'm a grad student here, and I've actually been writing my thesis on virtual production for the last 2 years. So I've been tracking a lot of what you're talking about. And I'm hoping that my question might be able to like mitigate some of the blocks that I'm not able to understand in your argument. You've sort of noted a couple of different aspects, right? Narrative possibility, embeddedness in code, propriety, information literacy, marketing. These are all very different studies and angles to the same issues of power. So what exactly are you arguing? Because there are multiple layers to the arguments of power within that. So maybe that question will help mitigate my hesitation to respond. Thank you.
For me, it flows from, I think, the overarching, I think all of these are connected together. For me, it's about it's about a data ecosystem. So so the big picture is who owns and controls data writ large. So and that's sort of it is a fascinating field because being immersed as you are in studying virtual production, which is constantly evolving, it seems at first the space. My initial argument used to be around game engine technologies is that the space for radical possibility closes as you move through the development pipeline, and that's typically the logic of game development. Like you have this rich and open engine-based architecture that is just a software framework that again gets connected to a designer, that gets connected to a story. So the radical possibility shuts down at every stage of the development pipeline. So software frameworks are open, they get formalized as an engine, they get attached to a particular intellectual property, and that then pushes them within a particular genre, that then makes them tell a particular story around. So it was closing down of queer or expressive possibility in ways that if you were just to take the Unity engine and use it as an independent developer, that possibility is still there. Although sort of the question becomes as Unity and Epic are no longer simply in the business of producing an engine. And Crytek produced an engine, Unity produces an engine, Epic produces an engine, Rockstar Games produces an engine. As they start to acquire in this case, an epic game, Quixel and, the three lateral, as you as an independent developer or artist, start to look outward for other types of influences or assets or libraries or data flows that may make your object act differently, what you find is those things are now shared within the same ecosystem. So it's not simply, oh, well, I have to buy everything from Unreal. It is as well, Unreal starts to shape what those products can do. So while Three Lateral used to be an independent Serbian-based company that could, who knows what we might do with 3D scanning. Well, now that is not just acquired by Unreal, but asked to do and not do certain things as part of the sort of Epic Games mission statement. And that's sort of so you're right, it's a complexity because there's that, but then there's well, what is the space for expressive possibility when documentation, and I study some documentation that tells users, that explains okay, as an independent developer, what should I do with this tool? Well, you start by reading through documentation that then pushes down a particular pathway that says, click here, then click there. So the element of exploration starts to shut down in documentation, in marketing, and I think all of these things, it's hard, you're right, it's hard to stitch these together because you run up against different critical assumptions driven by different material histories, different bodies of, but I think we have an obligation to try to start to stitch some of these things together. And it's interesting, the field of virtual production, because Mandalorian and Westworld are working with Unreal. So you may have a vision or a storyteller or a filmmaker who's working with intellectual property and that now has the Unreal technician on set who can then say, we can do this, but not this. So you start to determine possibility in virtual production, not based on, in some instances, what Lucas wants to do, but in other instances, what the pairing with Unreal and Epic Games suggests the technology can or should or will do based on a history of conventional use. I don't know if that cuts any closer, but it is a extremely complicated landscape as more and more of the sort of the underlying data sets get conformed in ways that we simply don't see.
Okay. So I just wonder though how it's different to pre-existing, Maya workflows where there were also artifacts that said do A, B, C, and D. I mean, any deployment of technology involves an authority over the workflow. That's that's even Zoom technologies, right? Click the mute button when you don't want to be heard, like that. So how are you distinguishing this as any different, I guess is my question.
They're similar in terms of their underlying architecture, as you point out. Yes, Zoom. And my first my first book on transient images was about online memorial archives. So how does the sort of architecture of a 9/11 memorial, or a virtual sort of remembrance online, where all of your personal images get conformed to a particular template, that's sort of the first iteration of this process of normalizing data according to these pre-built architectures. I'd say the difference here, so Zoom and Facebook, and Match.com, online dating sites, all conform information. And we can see that sort of ideological imperative, meaning there's a pre-built architecture that we're all asked to work within. And, but we understand that negotiation at work. I'd say for me, it's this object of authenticity or verisimilitude that starts to conceal what's happening, because it's one thing to have it in an interface culture where we understand the distinction or see the radical distinction between ourselves and the representation on screen. As those divides start to break down, in the case of photogrammetry, in the case of MetaHumans, it becomes harder and harder to see the coding layer than it might be in terms of what are my these become much more comfortable pre-built assets, and we start to, maybe not as scholars, but I think more and more deliberately, the architecture becomes so complex that we start to move to default mechanisms that are handed to us. And I think, and especially within the realm of story, that becomes a much more dangerous arc, I think, of simplification.
I think that, there we go, Tomas, yes.
Thank you, and thank you for a fantastic talk. And I'm interested in your publication that these algorithmic bodies are anatomically coded, and that this restricts some fluidity or queerness of some transcendence of code. But I wonder if if humans are coded, right? We have DNA. Our anatomic possibilities are not infinite. So I wonder if the problem here is the referent on humans that, and if that is the real like challenge here.
What are you what are you postulating there?
Well, my question is if there is a possibility of
Mhm.
designing a replication of a human that is
Mhm.
not anatomically coded and restricted, right? Given that humans are restricted by a code which is DNA, right? We are,
Mhm.
we don't have infinite possibilities. Our physical bodies cannot be, there's a limit in the queerness of our physical bodies.
Mhm.
And I wonder if the problem that we are talking could be summed up as, the problem is that humanity is being replicated and the physical body has limitations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is this level of, I think what you're suggesting too is it's the level of remediations that we're talking about. If we have this complication within the body itself, and then the body becomes, I think it is this, the photogrammetry library, the live scanning of the body suggests that you can capture we start to move away from we're capturing the materiality of the body, but not its essence of the body. So we start from, with the scanning library, to work from the surface of the body. So it's multiple levels of radical erasure. So the library is built on surface scans, which efface that sort of what you're talking about, the essential problem. And then the MetaHuman Creator, all these 3D building tools start to work from that sort of secondary level. So it's to try to get back to that. The question then becomes, does narrative, where that possibility gets sort of reinterpreted or re-encoded? Does an agency always get lost in terms of how these bodies are constructed, but return somehow in terms of what they do and say that might complicate how they're built?
But do you see a conflict there then? Do you feel that, I mean, I don't want to like translate the conversation too much, but do you think that there is a possibility to transcend that material aspect of humanity that this technology is somehow restricting? Would that be a correct way to put it?
Do I think the technology can actually, is the technology inherently a closed circuit of relations that cannot get us to a more transcendent? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I would say that. I wonder.
I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, is there? And now you're asking sort of an alternative sort of language. Like, is there an expressive possibility that simply is that potentiality out there and not realized? Like, and I think it's a good prompt. I think it's antithetical to the work that engine-based design ultimately does. I think this is the role of artificial intelligence too, is always this sort of simulation of intelligent behavior has to be logical behavior, that there is no sort of space for illogic or incorrect or failure. So I'd say it's the nature of these elements that they may not ever be able to push to that end.
Thank you.
We have a question from Paul, and then we have one from Laurel Carney that's in the chat box. So maybe we could start with Paul.
Sure. Thank you for the talk. There's just so many interesting directions this can go in. I wanted to ask more about the push for hyperrealism and sort of a familiar and legible form of hyperrealism that really came out strongly in the way these interfaces are designed. I've been looking at 3D media production in Japan, where it's often the fixation on realism seems to be a very sort of American thing. It's not like we could be making anime characters instead. Why do we need to do this? So I'm curious what you see as driving that. Is it more sort of with the history of Uncanny Valley discourse and trying to stay well away from that by not letting you actually get there with the interface? Or is it more that that's clearly where the big money is, to be able to make completely sort of plausible, realistic characters, as opposed to something that's maybe a little more unfamiliar to people? Or what is driving the need to keep it sort of safely hyper-realistic?
That's an interesting question, and I at some level, even in terms of from my perspective, I think it's the origin story of these technologies, and sort of in the largest quest of AI development in general, and its sort of interrelationship with either game forms or game technologies. AI, games are a testing ground for AI, so they ground it in terms of particular sort of questions. I think the fact that Epic and Unreal are grounded in game space is largely, and I say this with an understanding that even from sort of Japan, if we talk about Capcom, Capcom has always, at least in its video game space, has pushed in its engine development towards greater and greater hyperrealism. So I think it's the legacy of where these tools, in what industries they're coming out of, is orienting them to a certain sort of, I think that's where the push is coming from. So I think there is a particular bias within these particular game industries that is shaping that is pushing the technology or attaching that technology to that sort of visual bias that is simply getting replicated in aligning them with other entertainment industries. So you're right, there is the possibility in all of these engines in working in a 2D way, but that seems to be obfuscated by now the attachment of, I think it's the level of commerce of Unity or Epic Games and Unity to other parts of the entertainment complex that are sort of prioritizing certain types of project models. I think it'd be an interesting test case in terms of the metaverse, in terms of what is satisfying and not satisfying in terms of what's the visual logic of what's the visual vocabulary of the metaverse. I think it will be an interesting push to see if that becomes more and more aligned with what we're seeing in the photogrammetry of the MetaHuman Creator, or whether it still remains this sort of othered space. And without getting too far off, I think sort of the fact that sort of Fortnite and Epic Games have investments in that sort of material direction, I think there's going to be a strong push in terms of Epic controlling the visual vocabulary of what happens in those other spaces. But I think that's where it stems from. It's the origin stories of these tech companies.
Thank you, Eric. From Laurel, we have this question. I'm going to read it aloud. Sorry for the technologically rudimentary question, but I'm curious about the specific mechanisms of an algorithm determining a, quote, plausible face. Do you have any information about how this plausibility is specifically codified, and at what point in the process? Is it based on humans manually reviewing edge cases? Is there a possibility for users to push against or override that plausibility within the MetaHuman Creator as released, or is it too late by the time the data set reaches the user's hands?
That's an excellent question, and I can sort of radically simplify that by first saying that it is done by initially with the initial photogrammetry scan, so it's based on existing human physiognomy that gets sort of captured. So there's the original scan library that has some element of correction in terms of sort of humans reading through and reviewing those edge cases to create in the creation of the initial library. And then once those edge cases are corrected, then the AI learning model takes over and then can replicate those edge cases and eradicate those edge cases over and over and over again. So there's the initial human intervention that sets up the machine learning model that then identifies the edge cases, then it can slowly but surely make sure they get filtered out. If you look at all of the SileGAN, which is I think a good place to look at this, all of the documentation is on the GitHub website. So if you go to this person does not exist and click through, you can ultimately find the coding database on the NVIDIA style GAN site. It's all open source. The possibility to push against or override that plausibility, it becomes non-existent in the MetaHuman Creator. And they talk openly about this, is that you can't create an odd result. It will always, they have set the sliders, they have set the parameters in ways that do not allow you to push too far or to push the limits of plausibility. So the functional possibility, it is in fact too late by the time the data set reaches the user's hands in the case of the MetaHuman Creator. Now, what you can see is some people exporting, this is back to the Maya, some people then export these assets into Maya, where you can do a bit more subtle manipulation. So there's a way of regaining some agency over your character by pushing it into Maya.
And I mean, in terms of plausibility, like is what's defined as plausible? Is it plausible that someone might be fat? Is it plausible that someone might have a hair lip, or, you know, any range of disability? Because their idea of what's plausible seems like a certain very normative idea of obvious, right? Of a certain kind of perfect body that is, you know, with a certain body mass index and so on. And I'm just curious, you know, with the sliders, is there any possibility for someone, you know, who has a limp, for example?
Yeah, well, they have different body types. They have a range of body types, body sizes and shapes in their asset library. So you can, in fact, sort of mix and match. There are certain limits to how far, again, you can push on those. And then what the body does and how it performs is then simply a matter of the rigging. So you can perform deformations to the body in terms of how it moves, because that's not controlled by MetaHuman Creator. But in terms of when does an ear or nose no longer look like a nose, those are things, or a lip, there is the sort of normativizing function in terms of all of the basic facial features. Again, and this gets back to the AI sort of training model. If it can no longer recognize it as this particular facial attribute, it becomes this sort of marginal case. It becomes no longer plausible. It becomes an edge case that is not part of the data set. So there are limits on to what extent you can. I don't want to say, I use deform simply in the technical sense, but again, moving out of MetaHuman Creator into Maya, you can then start to change surface texture. You can change, you know, clearly you can add scars to a face, you can deform a face, you can do all of these other bodily deformations that you might not be able to do in MetaHuman Creator. The issue for me is often that becomes a second level of competence, of literacy, to know how to take the asset from Unreal and move it into Maya, deform, do the deformations and the additional rigging here, and then export it back into. So those who have the utmost literacy and competence are those who can push the bodily transformation the furthest, whereas most of us are set with and using sort of these default parameters.
Thank you. Laurel says, thank you. And we have a question from the one of the attendees who's not a panelist, Aguinaldo Mello. At the beginning of your presentation, you presented the possibility of replacing human actors with AI metahumans. What would be a metahuman actor without the unpredictable narrative layer inherent in human personality?
An interesting question. And at the moment, actually Unreal does not allow you to use its metahumans as intelligent agents, which is interesting. So they've drawn a line in the sand where you cannot use a metahuman as your Salesforce or your AI agent on your university tour. So there seems to be some sensitivity to that, to faking people or tricking people into thinking the metahuman. So it has to be used within a particular type of, I would say, sort of fictional context where you understand the metahuman as a character and not an agent, not an intelligent agent. I'm losing the thread on the question, but it's not. So Replica Studios with the automated sort of the AI sort of voice control that uses the human actor is subject to the same conditions since they're working with the MetaHuman character still as a character within a story as opposed to an agent outside of a sort of a narrative construct. So I think the question about what an AI agent might do in a sort of erratic or unpredictable way is attached to the context that they're inserted. And the best that I can do in terms of like, there are multiple use cases, but if these characters are traditionally, because again, we're talking about a game company, if these characters are traditionally being used as non-playable characters or companion characters within a game narrative, for the character to act too erratic within the game and be too unpredictable is going to lead to less than satisfactory gameplay for most traditional, AAA, games, which is where you'd see these characters. Like the character has to make sense. It has to be beatable. It has to be understandable. It can't act erratically because that can result in a certain amount of displeasure in traditional AAA game titles. So I think the narrative context might determine to what extent a certain level of erratic behavior might be allowable, but also acceptable depending upon that sort of the context of its use. I'd say the same about like a university tour. Like you have an intelligent agent, like someone wants some continuity at work there. What would be the acceptable context in which the character might act more erratically? And there are likely use cases where that could happen and that would be acceptable.
Thank you. Shrushti, another question?
Yeah, it just occurred to me, and I'm wondering what your thinking was behind using the word colonize in association with these companies. Are you building off of your existing theory, or like why not say control? Why colonize? It's a heavy word.
I use it in the sense that to me, colonizing suggests the way that they are acquiring assets. And I use the example of the metaverse because the fact that they may own the environment or the virtual stage, and they can populate that stage with characters, and then they can populate that stage with environmental assets and objects. For me, the notion of colonization suggests a certain pleasurable engagement or willful engagement with an epic games metaverse. So it has a certain, I wouldn't say there's a certain complicit nature in terms of the agreement. If we want to engage in these spaces, if we want to have an avatar in the metaverse, there's a certain willful adoption of the platform. It's a very seductive adoption of the platform. And for me, that's the power of the sort of the colonizing influence. There is an element of control, but there is this suggestion of a complicit agreement between those who want to participate in the tools with which they are able to participate, and the ability to then think about if it becomes a branded metaverse construction, that the limits of engagement are based on acquiring an Epic Games avatar to participate, or a Fortnite avatar, which is owned by Epic. Like it seems more about your pathway to entry is a matter of like who owns, and control doesn't feel like the appropriate. There is an element of control written in there, but I think the notion that possibility gets written out in terms of entry points, to me, feels more like a colonizing force.
I think we have a question from Tomas.
Yes, thank you. So I'm personally very interested in questions of governance around the metaverse, and I think the questions around what 3D assets and what 3D assets are not approved. I think that's deeply interested. But I think there is something to acknowledge that the labor behind the 3D assets is going to have to be done by someone. So I I mean, and that just probably has to be a company like Unreal, right? Like that's, I mean, there's probably have to be engines. I was recently playing around with Decentraland, which is a metaverse inspired application that works on blockchains. It's very interesting, but the engine that runs that, it's Unreal. I mean, there's no MetaHumans involved because it's a 3D space. But yeah. So I wonder if the question here is about like aesthetics, about the potential aesthetics of what MetaHumans can do, or if it's a question more about governance of cyberspace, right? And we can narrow it down on the metaverse and say that it's a question about the politics of what assets get validated and what assets don't get validated, right?
Mm-hmm. I would answer that by saying yes, I agree. I agree. It's about, I think it's both. It is about data governance. I would say, unfortunately, the data governance conditions often get radically simplified in terms of, they get typically centralized around issues of data security and data ethics. And when they typically skirt the questions of representation in these other sort of, at least in the policy debates about ownership of data, because those are easier questions. I think those are, I wouldn't say easier questions, that might be the wrong word, but those are the traditional policy questions that we ask about information space, and we ask less about what assets are allowed and what they can do there. Typically, first and foremost, get reduced to questions of ownership and privacy.
That's super
And
interesting.
go ahead.
No, sorry. It makes me think if there's an analogy with this in content moderation, right? Like what you can say on the internet and what you can look like on the metaverse. They seem to be the similar questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm aware that Facebook just introduced boundaries, and boundaries are, that's an interesting question about sort of I haven't really thought about this, so I'm not going to talk about it because it's going to sound like an unthought. But that's an interesting question where data governance and governance of behavior meets sort of the question of around the representation of self, around the avatar. So it's an interesting moment where data governance and questions of ethics and questions of bodies and representation start to come together, at least in that instance. We need to build a policy around behaviors, which is now as a sort of a visual, it takes a visual form, it becomes embodied, in that space.
Great, thank you.
Do we have any more questions, thoughts to share? I don't see anyone else from the off-screen space. Okay, well, thank you so much, Eric. It was very provocative, very interesting. Thanks for sharing. It was really great. And thank you to everyone for coming today. And we'll see you next week. Andrew, can you remind us what our talk is next week so we can do a little plug for it? Is it the podcaster?
Yeah, let me just unmute for a second and pull up the actual.
And before you say that, just let me say, I know we've got a lot of students, grad students in your program. These are questions that I'm actively working through. I know you're actively working through similar, parallel, divergent questions. So I'm happy to hear what you're working on, respond to what you're working on, and have you respond to what I'm like. These ideas are constantly in motion. So I'm happy to sort of share and talk more. And Heather can tell you how to reach me, and happy to continue conversations about the works, your work, my work, however it helps.
That is great. Thank you, Eric.
So, yep, we do have another event, same time next Thursday, 5 p.m. It will also be just on Zoom, so not in person, just on Zoom. And that's with Jorge Caraballo, who is former growth editor at Radio Ambulante, which is Latin America's most popular documentary podcast. His talk is entitled "How to Use Audio Storytelling to Cultivate a Community and Keep it Engaged."
Great, thank you. All right, well, I'll see the grad students there next week, and hopefully some of our guests will be there as well. And thank you again to Eric and I'm gonna offer you some virtual applause.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.